Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. We have a really interesting episode for you tonight. We're going to talk about two very important philosophers and economists in world history. The two of them are on opposite sides of the spectrum when it comes to economics. Adam Smith, who's considered the father of capitalism or the father of modern economics, and Karl Marx, who's considered the father of communism and really socialism as well. And we'll get into both of these men and the history of their philosophies, capitalism versus communism, tonight. Myself personally, I'm an unabashed and unapologetic capitalist. I believe that the capitalist system in human history has raised the most people out of poverty, has created the most successful Western nations, and has created the best opportunities for people to live, to thrive, to flourish, to live longer lives and happier and more healthy and wealthy lives. It's created the largest middle classes for countries that have tried it. We'll get into all the reasons why I believe that is tonight, but what I want to do is, as an amateur historian for you, is to look at both sides and look at it critically. So we're going to look at Adam Smith, what he believed, what his philosophies were, coming out of his great book, The Wealth of Nations. We're also going to look at Karl Marx and his philosophy of communism, what it was born out of, why it came about during the Industrial Revolution or the back end of it. What it believes and why it really was born, and what he and his partner Engels thought, and the reason they came up with this theory. And we want to give you a really balanced approach on that, and you can really decide for yourself which of these two philosophies you think is best. So let's go ahead and get into the history of Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Okay, this is Adam Smith versus Karl Marx, the history of capitalism versus communism. You see a great picture there on the bottom left of Adam Smith and his great book, The Wealth of Nations. We'll get into a breakdown of that book and what it really covered and what the major principles were that came out of it that really gave birth to the concept of capitalism and the concept of raising all boats. And you can see just above him a picture of the capital diagram, and that capital really drives growth and wealth and flourishing in countries. And then to the right, you see two great pictures of Karl Marx at different stages of his life. In between these two pictures of Karl Marx is the Communist Manifesto, which he co-wrote with Engels. And we'll get into also Engels, a little bit of his history as well. And we'll talk about what his philosophy of communism was. And just above that, you see the communism logo that many different organizations use who are communist around the world. And again, we'll get into all the different theories he has and foundations and why communism came about and why many countries still attempt to implement it even today. And even portions of the United States, which is the most capitalist country in history, still are looking to communism as a possibility. So Adam Smith versus Karl Marx, an introduction. Karl Marx was born in 1818 and he died in 1883. He was a German philosopher, an economist, and a revolutionary socialist whose theories like historical materialism and critiques of capitalism became foundational for modern communism and socialism. He was born in Trier, Germany, and his radical political writings and journalism led to expulsions from many different countries, including Prussia, France, and Belgium, who all kicked him out of their countries. Marx is best known for co-authoring the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels, and also writing Das Kapital, which is another big writing that he did that's still looked at today. These documents detailed his economic theories and his vision of a classless society, which is what communism is trying to get. It's really collectivism, if you think about it. That's really what he's espousing. He spent the last decades of his life in London, where he lived in poverty and continued to write and participate in international workers' movement. So that's a little bit about Karl Marx, and we'll get a little deeper into his background in just a bit, but it gives you a little flavor for who he was and what he did. Adam Smith was born in 1723. So as you can see, a full almost 100 years earlier. So Adam Smith was really born kind of on the front end of the Industrial Revolution, and Karl Marx was born on the back end of it. And there is some reason that that is significant. We'll talk about it. Adam Smith, born in 1723 and died in 1790, he was a Scottish philosopher and economist. He was considered the father of modern economics for his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, which came out in 1776, the same year of the United States Declaration of Independence, and just a couple years before France had their revolution. He championed free markets and the invisible hand guiding self-interest towards societal benefit, while also advocating for limited government intervention in the economy and significant roles in public education and infrastructure. His work was a product of the Scottish Enlightenment period, providing foundational concepts for classical economics and continues to influence economic thought even today in many different countries. You can imagine these two men and the documents and philosophies that they wrote really are the two emerging thought processes even 200 years later. So it's really fascinating if you think about it. We're still debating as a world and as a society which of these two paths is the way to go. Adam Smith, of course, believed in limited government. He didn't believe in no government. He thought there was a role for government, but very limited. And we'll talk about what those different areas are that he believed in. So one of the things that we need to frame this conversation around is the Industrial Revolution, which kicked off in 1760. And of course, Adam Smith had already been writing quite a few documents by then, but it lasted all the way to 1840, which was deep into Karl Marx's life. The background of the Industrial Revolution was a shift from agrarian, handicraft-based economies to industrialized mechanical ones, beginning in Britain in the mid-18th century. This led to urbanization as people moved to cities for factory work, but also to social upheaval and new societal structures. Improvements in farming techniques increased food production out at the farms, which supported a growing population. However, it also pushed people out of the farming industry and pushed them to look for work. This led to many people to migrate to cities in search of work. Key inventions like the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the power loom mechanized the textile industry as well, allowing for mass production. So now you had mass production in the farms, you had mass productions in the textiles. The development of the steam engine was crucial, providing a new power source for factories and transportation like trains and ships. Factors like the commercial revolution, a powerful navy, and a vast empire provided capital, markets, and raw materials that fueled industrial growth in the United States, British Empire, and other similar global powers. The rise of the factory system caused a massive shift of people from countryside to cities. This rapid urbanization led to overcrowding and poor living and working conditions. While many inventions improved the quality of life for some, the rapid growth of cities led to slums, pollution, and disease for many workers. The harsh conditions in factories spurred the formation of labor movements and unions to fight for better wages, hours, and working conditions. Education systems were much more readily available to the common man, and for the first time, lower class people had opportunities to be upwardly mobile, leading to the term the American dream. Wealth creation took off in all westernized countries as they followed capitalist models. So you can see we started to have some real early experiments in the capitalist system in many of these Western countries, and these countries really were flourishing. The wealth creation was truly astronomical. In some cases, there's an estimation that some of these countries were growing at something like 20% per year for some time in terms of GDP. But you can see there was also some downsides with overcrowding and with slums and with working conditions, which obviously spurred to some of the disagreements and disenchantment of capitalism by some, especially in the lower class. So let's talk about Karl Marx, his early life. Karl Marx was born on May 5th, 1818 in Trier, Prussia, which is now Germany. His father, who was a lawyer, converted from Judaism to Lutheranism, which was the common religion in Germany at that time, because he wanted to avoid anti-Semitism and societal limitations on Jews, which was already kicking off in the early 1800s. Karl Marx grew up in an affluent family and had the best education throughout his life. So you just understand that he became the espouser of the communist thought process, but he did grow up during a time where his family was very affluent. Marx studied law at the University of Bonn and later moved to Berlin, where he became influenced by a radical political thought and writings of philosophers like G.W.F. Hegel. Hegel kind of became his mentor throughout his life. He became involved with the Young Hegelians, which was a movement that criticized established institutions. After graduating, Marx became a journalist, but his radical views led to conflict with authorities. He was expelled from Germany at that time. He moved to Paris, where he met Friedrich Engels, who became his lifelong collaborator. His writings, which included critiques of Hegel's idealism, radical writings, and organizing in Paris of anti-establishment groups, again led to his expulsion from France. So he was getting so radicalized and he was causing such a ripple in every country where he lived with his writings that he kept getting kicked out of these countries. He moved to Brussels, Belgium, and attempted to get a university position. Marx was eventually forced to leave Brussels as well because of his radical organizing of protests, and settled in London, England in 1849, where he would remain the rest of his life. It's really interesting to get some of this background here about how he grew up in an affluent family, moved around from country to country, became a radical organizer and writer, so much so that governments got very nervous by his presence and by his influence and would often kick him out of their countries, eventually settling in London, where he would spend the rest of his days with Engels, writing about Communist Manifesto and other thought processes. In terms of Karl Marx's family life, Marx married Jenny von Westphalen from an aristocratic family, and they were married in 1843 after a 7-year engagement. You see a picture there to the right of Marx and his wife and his family, and you can see down below another photo of all of them together. They had 7 children, but 4 died in infancy or childhood, which was a huge source of great pain for Jenny, as you can imagine. Their 3 daughters who survived to adulthood were Jenny Longuet, Laura Marx, and Eleanor Marx. Eleanor, who was the youngest daughter, died by suicide in 1898 at the age of 43, after discovering her partner had remarried without her knowledge. So you can see this was a family that had tremendous sadness and tremendous tragedy in their lives, having so many of their children die in infancy and then having one actually take her own life. The family also experienced severe poverty, particularly during their lifetime in London. They relied on financial assistance from Engels, his partner, who helped with business ventures and also provided regular financial assistance to the family. Marx and his family also received support from their respective families, so her family and his family as well. Helene de Muth, who was the family's long-serving housekeeper and helped with the kids, became Marx's mistress and gave birth to a son to him, and his name was Freddie, in 1851. This was a huge scandal that he was sleeping with the housekeeper, as you can imagine. Marx refused to acknowledge the child publicly and persuaded Engels to claim paternity as a cover story for Freddie. Despite the scandal, de Muth continued to live with the Marx family until her death and was buried with them in Highgate Cemetery in London. It's really fascinating if you think about all the things that were going on in the Marx family, as you can see. It gives you a real good sense for Marx and what was going on with all his children. So in terms of Karl Marx and his economic and political philosophies, Karl Marx's economic theory is a critique of capitalism, centered on the labor theory of value, arguing that the value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time to produce it. This leads to extraction of surplus value by capitalist class, or the bourgeoisie, from the labor of the working class, who are the proletariat. This exploitation, according to Marx, results in alienation for workers and is the driving force behind class struggle. Marx predicted that the competitive pressures of capitalism would lead to monopolies, economic crises, and the eventual overflow of the system by the proletariat, or a revolution. While capitalism has adapted and not collapsed as predicted, some of its features, such as increasing economic inequality, are still debated in the context of Marx's theories. Marx and Engels together had also preliminarily started to speak out about equity versus equality, And we even hear that term today, equity, which is all about trying to even the playing field for everyone to be the same, and to essentially crush meritocracy in a society. Karl Marx's political theory, Marxism, which is what we call it today, centers on historical materialism. This theory states that the economic base of a society, or the means and relations of production, determines its social, political, and ideological structures. Changes in the mode of production, like the shift from feudalism to capitalism, are driven by economic development and technological advancements, leading to societal transformation, as we saw in the Industrial Revolution. Marx argued that capitalism alienates workers from the products of their labor, the process of labor itself, their fellow workers, and their own potential. So that's really his argument, is that capitalism is great for some, but not great for most. That's essentially what he believes. Friedrich Engels, who was Karl Marx's partner, this is what his economic and political philosophies were. He was a German philosopher and co-founder of the modern communism movement by Karl Marx, known for works like Communist Manifesto and The Condition of the Working Class in England. He was born in 1820, and he worked in his family's textile business, which allowed him to witness firsthand the harsh conditions of the industrial capitalism in England. His personal observations and early writings on social injustices provided a foundation for his lifelong collaboration with Marx. He also bankrolled Marx and his family, as we mentioned before. After Marx's death, he edited and published volumes of Das Kapital. Engels continued to write extensively throughout his life, producing such works as The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State in 1884, and then he died in London in 1895. His theories have had a profound and lasting impact on political thought and revolutionary movements. His works critiqued capitalism's inherent contradictions, arguing it was a system of exploitation that would ultimately be overthrown by the working class through a socialist revolution. Key contributions include the analysis of the relationship between class, gender, and private property, and a focus on cyclical, unstable nature of capitalist economies. So you can see he and Marx were very much brothers in arms when it comes to communism and their critiques of capitalism. They believe very much in collectivism. Everybody's in it together. We're all in the same boat. We all need to be rowing in the same direction. And meritocracy was overrated, and that essentially everybody should be provided the same opportunities and the same income and the same state in life. So you can see he really was a very influential thinker and writer as well at the time. Karl Marx, his Communist Manifesto, the document he's the most famous for, that he wrote with Engels, is a political pamphlet that was written by the two of them, and it was commissioned by the Communist League and published in London in 1848. And you can see two great pictures to the right. The one on the top there is the original publication. There's only a couple copies left. This one is actually in a museum in London, the original Communist Manifesto from 1848. And down below is a bound copy of it as well. The text represents the first and most systematic attempt by these two founders of scientific socialism to codify for wide consumption the historical materialist idea, namely that the history of all hitherto existing society in which social classes are defined by the relationship of people to the means of production. Published amid the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, the manifesto has become one of the world's most influential political documents. The text outlines the relationship between the means of production, relations of production, forces of production, and modes of production, and posits that changes in society's economic base affect changes in its superstructure. The authors assert that capitalism is marked by exploitation of the proletariat by the ruling bourgeoisie. They argue that capital's need for flexible labor force dissolve the old relations, and that its global expansion in search of new markets creates a world after its own image. So again, you can see this document really breaks down the communist theory, the manifesto, what they believe about capitalism, and how really all people deserve certain rights and certain outcomes, certain equity outcomes. Some of the critiques of communism, and we'll just break these down in this slide here. Some of the critiques of communism: some democratic socialists and social democrats reject the idea that societies can achieve socialism only through class conflict and proletarian revolution. So there's some people that believe in communism but don't think it requires a revolution or any kind of violence. Many anarchists reject the need for a transitory state phase. They believe that it doesn't really necessarily require the state, that it can be done by private citizens in a private setting, but still have the same impact from a communist perspective. Some thinkers have rejected the fundamentals of Marxist theory, such as the historical materialism and labor theory of value, and have gone on to criticize capitalism and advocate socialism using other arguments. Various thinkers have argued that a communist state would, by its very nature, erode the rights of its citizens due to the postulated violent revolution and dictatorship of the proletariat, its collectivist nature, reliance on the masses rather than individuals, historical materialism, and centrally planned economy. So this really is the core and crux of the major criticism of communism, is that it essentially strips the individual of their rights. And it essentially gives most of the power and rights to the state and to the collective. These points have also been debated by various thinkers who argue that we consistently and currently exist in a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and that Marxism is not deterministic. The most important critiques of communism are: in a capitalist society, the prospect of individual profit and the risk of financial failure drive innovation and efficiency. In contrast, critics argue that a communist system which lacks a direct link between effort and personal gain disincentivizes workers and managers from exceeding minimal requirements. And I will tell you just a personal anecdote here that as a kid with my parents, we lived in a communist country. It was actually Yugoslavia at the time. And I remember multiple times when they needed to call workmen to come in and work on a toilet or some other aspect of the house. They were incredibly inefficient. They would come take a look at it, and then they would go leave for lunch. And they would come back a couple hours later and maybe bring a part and maybe do one little thing, and then they would leave for the day. And it would take what it would take a regular person in a Western country an hour to do. It would take them 2 or 3 days to do a very simple task. They just had no incentive to do anything better. And they really were more about, taking lunch and taking breaks and that kind of thing. So just an anecdote there about what I noticed about communism and what it does to individual effort and personal gain and incentives. So let's talk about Adam Smith, his early life. Adam Smith, who is considered the father of capitalism or the father of economics, was born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland. Smith's father died 5 months before his birth, so he never knew his birth father. He was a good student, and he went to the finest schools growing up in Kirkcaldy. He attended the University of Glasgow and was the #1 ranked student there, and then later attended Balliol College, Oxford, though he eventually became disenchanted with the quality of the instruction at Oxford, and he left in 1746. So you can imagine this kind of mind that he had. He was bored at Oxford. Pretty amazing. After returning to Scotland, he became a professor at the University of Glasgow, lecturing on ethics and economics. Smith's first major published work was The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, which explored the nature of morality and the role of sympathy in human society. So he really was getting into kind of the way that humans interact with each other in that first work. Then, in his most famous work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776, the same year as the American Declaration of Independence. Wealth of Nations, as it's called, critiqued mercantilist policies and argued that free trade and competition would lead to greater prosperity for both individuals and nations. The book, over the last 250 years, has become the definitive book on capitalism for college and graduate students, as well as policymakers around the world. Smith is regarded as the foundational figure of classical economics and modern economics. His work not only laid the groundwork for understanding capitalism, but also emphasized the importance of social factors in economic development. You see some great pictures there of Adam Smith when he was a little bit younger and then later in his life. So really had a fascinating background, and his thought processes and all these different works that he put out, really we're still studying today and still analyzing how we can put them to work in our capitalist societies. In terms of Adam Smith and his family life, it was marked by the early death of his father, as we mentioned before, leaving him to be raised by his mother, Margaret Douglas, in Kirkcaldy, Scotland, where he lived with her and his cousin after his mother's death. Smith never married or had a family, remaining a bachelor throughout his life. Smith's father, Adam Smith Sr., was a customs officer and lawyer who died 5 months before he was born. His mother was Margaret Douglas from a family of wealthy landowners. A well-known childhood story recounts him being briefly abducted by gypsies at the age of 3 for an entire year before being rescued by his uncle by paying a ransom payment. So you can imagine how that might have shaped him from 3 to 4. He was being raised by gypsies and then eventually was rescued by his uncle. Smith remained close to his mother, and after she passed away, he lived with his cousin in Panmure House in Scotland, which was their family home. Biographer Dugald Stewart noted that Smith had a brief romantic attachment to a young lady when he was a young man, but after a disappointment in that relationship, he abandoned the thoughts of marriage. Although he lived a largely solitary private life, Smith was active in Edinburgh's intellectual community. He hosted prominent figures of the Scottish Enlightenment for discussions at his private home, and discussions would turn into 4-hour debates over meals and wine. So wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall at some of those 4-hour debates at his house, talking about economics and all the issues of the day? Smith was also a founding member of the Oyster Club, a dinner group for members of the Scottish literati. So you can see he really was intellectual. He was a bachelor, and he spent his time writing, thinking, debating, and spending time really thinking about how we can make the world a better place. In terms of his economic philosophies, Adam Smith articulated In the Wealth of Nations, and it centers on a free market capitalist system driven by individual self-interest and the invisible hand to achieve societal benefit. Key tenets include the benefits of laissez-faire policies and government non-interference in the economy, the division of labor to increase productivity, and the belief that individuals acting in their own interest naturally serve for the greater good. Laissez-faire economy. Smith advocated for minimal government intervention in the economy, allowing free markets to operate without regulation. In terms of the self-interest and invisible hand, he argued that individuals pursuing their own self-interest, guided by an invisible hand, would unintentionally promote the best outcomes for society as a whole. In terms of division of labor, Smith highlighted that dividing tasks among workers increased efficiency in the overall output of goods and services, a concept exemplified by his pin factory analogy. Economic growth, he proposed that national wealth could grow steadily through this system, driven by the productivity gains from the division of labor and the freedom of individuals and markets. And of course, innovation was a big part of what he was talking about. He said, you're going to innovate much more if you leave self-interest in place and let people like entrepreneurs be entrepreneurs. In terms of capitalism, his ideas form the foundation of capitalist thinking, asserting that free market economies are the most productive and beneficial for society. So you can see he really was completely diametrically opposed to the central planning vision of Marx and Engels. He really believed that the less you intervene in an economy and the less the government does to put any kind of shackles on it, the more upside you're going to have both as a society and for the individual. Adam Smith's political philosophies, while famous for promoting free markets and the invisible hand in economics, his political thought emphasized that government must protect property, ensure justice, and provide necessary infrastructure, with intervention beyond these limits often being unjustified and ineffective. His thoughts about national defense was protecting the nation from external threats. His thoughts on administration of justice was establishing and maintaining a system of laws and courts to protect individuals from injustice and oppression by others. His thoughts on public works was providing public works and institutions that are not profitable for individuals to undertake and are beneficial to society, such as education and infrastructure to the society. His political thought is rooted in concern for human flourishing. That's really all he cared about, was how can we get the individual and our societies to flourish more. This extended beyond economic wealth to encompass virtuous character, moral development, and a just society with a focus on freedom of the individual. His political thought is downstream from his moral philosophy, particularly his belief in a virtuous, compassionate society that arises from inherent moral sentiments of the individuals. Adam Smith's interest in the American Revolution stemmed from his economic and political philosophy as detailed in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations. And it is written many times on how interested and how much he was following what was happening over in America in our push for revolution, our push for independence. He was rooting it on very much so, even though he was from Scotland. He very much believed in this new system that America was putting in place, which was a government by the people, for the people, and very much focused on protection of the individual rights of individuals, of people. He supported American independence, believing colonies were creating a new form of government by the people and for the people based on principles of free markets, limited government that were essentially for prosperity and liberty. Smith critiqued Britain's mercantilist policies, arguing they harmed the British economy and that the colonies should gain representation in Parliament or be granted independence. So you can see he, as a Scotsman, though, was looking across what England was doing and what the colonies over in America were doing. And he understood why they were pushing for independence, and he believed in it, and he really supported it. It really lined up very much with his economic and political philosophies. In terms of Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations, it was an influential text published by Adam Smith in 1776. Its full title was An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations. Smith wrote the book to describe the industrialist capitalist system that was upending the mercantilist system. Mercantilism held that wealth was fixed and finite, and it was a zero-sum game. The only way to prosper was to hoard gold and place tariffs on products from around the world. According to this theory, nations should sell their goods to other countries while buying nothing in return. Predictably, countries fell into rounds of retaliatory tariffs that choked off international trade. The central thesis of Smith's Wealth of Nations is that our individual need to fulfill self-interest results in societal benefit. He called the force behind this fulfillment the invisible hand, which is one of his biggest concepts. And you see a picture there to the right of that invisible hand and how it guides the economy overall. Self-interest and the division of labor in an economy result in mutual interdependencies that promote stability and prosperity through the free market mechanism. Smith rejected government interference in market activities. He believed that a government's three functions should be to protect national borders, enforce civil law, and engage in public works. Smith argued that by giving everyone the freedom to produce and exchange goods as they pleased, which is free trade, and opening the markets up to domestic foreign competition, and that was the way to go. People's natural self-interest would promote greater prosperity than could stringent government regulations. And this he agreed with passionately. So you can see the debate we're having even today around, do you want to go free market or do you want to go with government central planning? That's really what we're talking about here. There's a great picture there to the bottom of the book, The Wealth of Nations. I believe everybody should read this book. It's a really important book. And it really helps you understand the general theories that we're still debating even today around economics. Some of the critiques of capitalism by the other side, by socialists and by communists. So critiques of free market capitalism include its tendency to cause market failures like pollution and monopolies, and to create massive economic inequality, social instability, and focus on materialism. Other criticisms highlight how the system can lead to poor working conditions, exploitation and lack of essential public goods, and a commodification of human life. Critics also argue that free markets can result in harmful products, as seen in the Volkswagen diesel emissions and Takata airbags cases. The theory is that free markets often fail to account for negative externalities, such as pollution, where the costs are borne by society rather than the producer or consumer of the goods. In terms of monopolies, competition can be undermined by monopolies or cartels requiring government regulation like antitrust laws to prevent companies from gaining too much power. In terms of inequality, the system can lead to massive concentration of wealth and power, with the gap between rich and poor widening significantly. Some argue this inequality is inherent and leads to social and economic instability. In terms of materialism and selfishness, critics argue that the emphasis on individual gain and competition fosters selfishness and materialistic culture. Dehumanization, by placing a high value on individual and competition, the system can lead to dehumanization and atomization of society. Exploitation, the pursuit of profit, can lead to the exploitation of workers, with some arguing that capitalism's core is exploitative and alienating. Poor working conditions and wages. In a purely free market, there can be a tendency for wages to fall to subsistence levels and for working conditions to be poor, as seen in the case of predatory lenders and other harmful industries. So you can see these are all the different arguments on the other side about capitalism, some of its flaws and some of the things that don't actually deliver in the market. I disagree with most of these myself, but I do understand what these arguments are. There's a really good book about capitalism and its critics by John Cassidy, and it really rolls up all the criticisms of capitalism over the many decades we've been looking at it. Let's look at the performance of capitalism versus communism. This is just pure performance of the world economy. The first one is, when it comes to capitalist societies, they generally show higher sustained long-term growth due to market incentives and resource allocation, whereas communist economies often experience lower productivity and growth rates due to centralized planning and lack of innovation incentives. So that's just kind of common sense if you think about it, that the capitalist societies will be much more productive and give you much higher GDP per capita. Also, in terms of wealth inequality, capitalist societies tend to produce higher levels of income and wealth inequality due to private ownership and market competition, whereas communist societies aim for equal wealth distribution, leading to low levels of official inequality, though often with low overall living standards. So what you get with communism is you may get everybody at the same level, but it actually lowers all boats, whereas capitalism raises all boats. That's kind of the concept that we see in the actual numbers. In terms of innovation, capitalism incentivizes innovation through profit motives and competition among private firms. So you see much more innovation in a capitalist society. In communism, it's historically linked to individual innovation due to the lack of personal gain. So you have in terms of capitalist economies, when it comes to innovation, they're historically limited in terms of their individual innovation due to the lack of personal gain. So again, it always comes back to individual incentives. In a communist society, there's just no incentive to actually innovate. In terms of transition effects in capitalist economies, transitioning to capitalism from communism often results in an initial economic shock, but evidence suggests that rapid reformers in those countries outperform gradual ones over the long term. And we've actually seen this in many situations, countries going from communism to capitalism and over time becoming much more successful. Even recently with Argentina going from a communist/socialist regime, and in a very short amount of time adopting capitalist ideas, they have become one of the real rising stars of South America. When you see Western or capitalist countries going the other direction, going towards more communism, more socialism, you see their GDPs falling, you see their innovation falling, and you see fewer and fewer opportunities over time. In terms of economic freedom and human development, these are numbers that can be measured, and they're measured by the World Economic Forum and others. You can see in very repressed countries, mostly unfree, moderately free, mostly free, and all the way free. In those free countries versus the repressed countries, the amount of economic freedom and human development for the individual is way, way higher, which just makes sense. An individual is going to always flourish much more within a capitalist system. And then in terms of increasing economic freedom and economic growth, the actual GDP numbers you can see here, in terms of the past 25 years, countries that gain economic freedom through capitalism have an average of a 2.6% GDP growth over 25 years, whereas in communist or socialist countries, their GDPs are about 1.5%, so significantly less. And if you equate this over enough years and enough decades, the signs of this in terms of what it does to your society really show. This additional growth of 1.1% on average across these 25 years means that you see those capitalist societies really thriving and you see the socialist communist countries really struggling. In terms of capitalism versus communism, is it a zero-sum game? The concepts of communism as a zero-sum game and capitalism raises all boats represents contrasting economic philosophies regarding the nature of wealth creation and distribution. The zero-sum perspective of communism argues that one person's gain is another person's loss, while the raise all boats metaphor describes an expanding economy that benefits everyone, which is what capitalism is. And you can see here to the right, the core philosophy of communism sees economic activity as a struggle over the fixed amount of resources. Therefore, wealth is inherently finite, and to achieve equality, wealth must be redistributed from the wealthy to the less fortunate. Whereas in capitalism, free markets and competition create new wealth and grow the overall economy. The tide of economic growth lifts the standard of living for all people at all income levels. So that's the idea around capitalism. In terms of the view of wealth for communism, wealth is a static pie that exists in limited supply. The goal is to divide this pie evenly among the population. Whereas in capitalism, wealth is not fixed. It's not a static pie and can be created through innovation, trade, and productivity gains and GDP gains. And the pie can get bigger for everyone. So everyone gets a piece of it. In terms of communism, the role of the state, the government plays a central role in controlling the means of production and orchestrating the redistribution of wealth. And in capitalism, the government's role is to protect private property and enforce contracts while limiting interference in the free market. So the less government, the better in a capitalist society. In terms of incentives, on the communist side, economic benefits are collectively owned with the goal of eliminating competition. Critics argue that this removes the incentive for innovation and hard work, leading to inefficiency. And then on the capitalist side, private ownership and the profit motive act as a powerful incentive for individuals to innovate, work, and take risks, which in turn can lead to economic growth and job creation. So you can see these two philosophies are diametrically opposed to the way they look at the economy. One looks at it as a static pie with limited supply, and the other looks at it as an unlimited pie that will grow infinitely as long as the government stays out of the way. It gives you a really good sense for these two philosophies and how they compete. In terms of capitalism versus communism today in 2025, the debate between capitalism and communism is not a simple comparison of pure systems, but rather a complex discussion focused on real-world applications and the problems that they face today. Modern economic systems are typically a mix of capitalist and socialist elements, making the discussion a critique of present realities rather than a theoretical choice between two opposites. No country has ever implemented a pure form of either system, so it's hard to compare them in a complete way. But as is proven, communism has been imposed at the end of a gun in most situations in history, whereas capitalism has been allowed in Western countries, especially, to flourish in most cases. New forms of competition, the global great power competition in 2025 is not an ideological clash between communism and capitalism, as it was during the Cold War. Instead, competition between US, China, and Russia is now largely defined by a contrast between liberal internationalism and illiberal nationalism. The more governments interfere in a free market, the more citizens suffer and the less GDP growth countries get, as well as wealth accumulation, and the more the middle class shrinks. The bigger the middle class is in a country, the higher citizen happiness measures increase. As countries open up and reinforce Adam Smith's principles for economy and government, the more the individual citizen can flourish. And you can see a map there to the right of what it looks like. All the countries in blue are capitalist democracies for the most part. And all the countries that are in red are either socialist or communist. And what you'll see if you look at the data over the last 25, 50, 100 years, the Western democracies that are capitalist in nature are thriving and doing much better economically. You can see some of the countries just below that that are capital countries, and then below that are the socialist and communist countries. And if you look deep into how they've all done economically, you'll see the capitalist countries are significantly better. So some quotes about capitalism and communism. Capitalism has brought with it progress, not merely in production, but also in knowledge. And that's something that a lot of people don't debate. They talk about mainly GDP and economics and productivity growth and things like that. But what they don't talk about is capitalism also brings innovation and knowledge. And it has much more in terms of its overall growth. Communism is not love. Communism is a hammer which we use to crush the enemy. And that's Mao Zedong. And some of the greatest rulers on the communist and socialist side, of course, have adopted the Marxist theories and have used them as a hammer. Capitalism demands the best of every man, his rationality, and rewards him accordingly. It leaves every man free to choose the work he likes, to specialize in it, to trade his product for the product of others. It's really, truly a free system, as you can see. Communism has never come to power in a country that was not disrupted by war or corruption or both. And that's John F. Kennedy. Obviously, he was a fierce anti-communist. In a capitalist society, all human relationships are voluntary. Men are free to cooperate or not, to deal with one another or not, as their own individual judgments, convictions, and interests dictate. So it's all about freedom. Communism is the death of the soul. It is the organization of total conformity, in short, of tyranny, and it is committed to making tyranny universal. And that's Adlai Stevenson. Prior to capitalism, the way people amassed great wealth was by looting, plundering, and enslaving their fellow man. Capitalism made it possible to become wealthy by serving your fellow man. So it really is a complete change in the way humans can get wealthy and be successful. Not in enslaving their fellow man, but by serving their fellow man. The tyranny of communism is as old as the pharaohs and the pyramids, that the state stands above all men and their individual aspirations. That's Robert Kennedy. The superior freedom of the capitalist system, its superior justice, and its superior productivity are not three superiorities, but one. The justice follows from the freedom, and the productivity follows from the freedom and the justice. So it gives you a good sense for how economy, government, freedom, and productivity all are intertwined in one system, as you can see. That's what Adam Smith would have wanted. Communism doesn't work because people like to own stuff. I thought that was a pretty funny quote by Frank Zappa, and it really is true. You know, communism goes against self-interest, it goes against individual wants and desires, and it goes against incentives, which human beings want to be able to achieve. Capitalism will continue to eliminate mass poverty in more and more places, and to increasingly marked extent if it is merely permitted to do so. And that's really the key, is if governments interfere and intervene in the free market system, the more they do, the less capitalism can thrive. The more they take their hands off of the free market system that we know, the more they take their hands off to the free market system, the more successful it'll be. The goal of socialism is communism, and that's Vladimir Lenin. And that really is true. Anybody who says that, oh, we're socialists, but we're not communists, well, socialism truly is the first step towards communism. Capitalism is the most powerful tool for positive social change. So again, it's not just about economy. Economy is one step towards the society that we want, but it really becomes the way that we can have social change and become the society that we'd like. Many of Reagan's listeners thought he was dreaming, but Reagan had a faith in freedom. He knew that communism, although militarily powerful, was ideologically dead. He knew what our founders knew, that in a truly legitimate government, power does not come out of the barrel of a gun, but only from the consent of the people. And that was Sam Brownback who said that about Reagan's thoughts on capitalism versus communism. So hopefully that gives you a really good sense for Karl Marx, for his partner Engels, for Adam Smith, for capitalism versus communism, their history, how they formed, how we're still dealing with it today. Governments are trying both versions all across the world, and where we're seeing the flourishing and where we're seeing countries that are not flourishing, and which systems they're actually adopting. So hopefully you enjoyed that. We're going to go ahead and dive into a couple of video clips, and then we will come back and talk about those on the other side.
Karl Heinrich Marx, the father of Marxism, was born on May 5, 1818 in the Kingdom of Prussia, part of the German Confederation.
His grandfathers on both sides came from lines of famous rabbis, but his own father had converted to Protestantism, given the barriers to Jewish involvement in society as full citizens.
In 1835, Marx left home to attend the university, where he became fascinated with the teachings of German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel.
He had a full and exciting life, but was captivated by these big ideas coming from Hegel about what determined the path of a society of human civilization.
Between 1843 and 1845, Karl Marx forged two relationships that changed the course of his life.
One was to his wife, Jenny von Westphalen, who came from the Prussian aristocracy. A happy marriage, 7 children. And the other was his intellectual bonding with Friedrich Engels, who brought to the relationship a set of experiences and knowledge that really opened Marx's eyes to new approaches.
In 1848, Marx and Engels laid out their concept of socialism in their most famous work, the Communist Manifesto. In their writings, they championed the worker and advocated a classless society that dissolved bonds between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie.
The Communist Manifesto is not only Marx maturing from a philosopher and economist into a revolutionary and an activist, it's also remarkably well-timed. The ink was barely dry when a wave of revolution swept all over Europe. He was seen as so seditious that he couldn't find a home anywhere in continental Europe, and therefore exiled to London.
In London, Karl took a job as a European correspondent to the New York Tribune.
Writing for the American market, he naturally had to turn his attention to American politics to an extent. The crisis over slavery, the abolitionist movement, and ultimately the Civil War.
Marx went on to write economic and political works, including Das Kapital. In 1864, Marx was elected to the General Council of the International Workingmen's Association, where he fought against capitalism as well as the anarchist wing of the organization.
In his travels in Europe and in the United States, he had an international perspective on things. He had a worldwide view, a very, very wide aperture.
By the early 20th century, Marx's theories became increasingly popular and were adopted by different countries. The Russian Revolution of 1917 ushered in the first communist government, and after World War II, socialism and communism spread to countries throughout Europe, Asia, and Latin America.
I think that communism appealed because it provided such a contrast with the existing economic situation.
Whether he foresaw it or not, his impact on revolutionary movements from Russia to China to Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea has been immense. They all base their legitimacy and their program on Marxism.
Karl Marx died of illness on March 14, 1883, and is buried in Highgate Cemetery in London. On his tombstone is inscribed the final line of the Communist Manifesto: "Workers of all lands unite."
Ideas have consequences, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and sometimes catastrophic, like the ideas of Karl Marx. Born in Trier, Germany in 1818, Marx didn't invent communism, But it was on his ideas that Lenin and Stalin built the Soviet Union, Mao built Communist China, and innumerable other tyrants, from the Kims in North Korea to the Castros in Cuba, built their communist regimes. Ultimately, those regimes and movements calling themselves Marxist murdered about 100 million people and enslaved more than 1 billion. Marx believed that workers, specifically those who did manual labor, were exploited by capitalists, the people who owned, as Marx put it, the means of production, specifically factories, but who did very little physical labor themselves. Only a workers' revolution, Marx wrote in Das Kapital, could correct this injustice. What would that revolution look like? Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels spelled it out point by point in the Communist Manifesto. It included the abolition of property and inheritance, and the centralization of credit, communication, and transport in the hands of the state, and a lot more along the same lines. In other words, the state owns and controls pretty much everything. This notion was widely discussed and debated in European intellectual circles during Marx's lifetime, but nothing much came of it until Vladimir Lenin took power in Russia in 1917. This changed everything. Despite its repeated economic failures, Lenin's Russia, which became known as the Soviet Union, became the model for dictators around the world. Wherever Marx's ideas were practiced, life got worse. Not by a little, but by a lot. There is not a single exception to this rule. Not the Soviet Union, not Eastern Europe, not China, not North Korea, not Vietnam, not Cuba, not Venezuela, not Bolivia, not Zimbabwe. Wherever Marxism goes, economic collapse, terror, and famine follow. So, if cataclysmic failure, meaning terrible human suffering, is the inevitable legacy of Marxism, why do so many people, and now especially young people, defend it? The most common answer Marxism's advocates offer is that they, whoever they are, Lenin, Stalin, Chavez, never really practiced Marxism. They all somehow got it wrong. Marxism, we are told, is, at its essence, about sharing what we have, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, as Marx put it. Maybe that sounds good to you, but what does it mean? Who determines ability? Who determines need? The answer is the state, the ruling elite. Under Marxism, that's who has all the power. That's why the truth is this. Marxist dictators like Lenin, Mao, and Pol Pot really did get Marxism right. They wanted absolute power, and Marxism gave them the way to get it. Karl Marx never had to face the consequences of his theories. He lived most of his adult life breathing the free air of London, England, living off the generosity of his collaborator and patron, Engels, who, as it happens, inherited his money from his wealthy merchant father. Marx spent his days in the reading room of the British Museum, researching and writing. Although he was obsessed with the term scientific, he was never able to marshal data to prove his theories. There's a good reason for this. There was no data to prove his theories. For all his time in the library, Marx couldn't find any evidence to suggest that capitalism, the free exchange of goods and services through privately owned business, was a passing phase. Throughout the industrial age, working conditions constantly improved and wealth expanded. Marx had to rely on outdated reports to make his case, and even then he had to manipulate the data to get it to conform to his predetermined theories. But Marx really had no interest in proving his theories. He knew that they could be put into practice only by brute force. He said so himself. Of course, in the beginning, communism cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads, he wrote. His ends could be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. All existing social conditions. That's religion, family, personal possessions, freedom, and democracy. They all had to go in order to achieve Marx's vision of an earthly paradise. But since few people give up their liberties and property voluntarily, creating a Marxist state has always required guns, prisons, and summary executions. Marx's many disciples from Lenin on never considered this a problem. Some, like revolutionary poster boy Che Guevara, considered it a bonus. I don't need proof to execute a man, Che is said to have boasted. I only need proof that it's necessary to execute him. If you're still a fan of Marxism after all the death, suffering, and destruction it's caused, that's your right. But own up to it. Don't hide behind the "it's never really been tried" line. It has.
Before Adam Smith and his teaching rose to popularity, the world was dictated by an economic theory known as mercantilism. Now, we have discussed mercantilism before when we looked at the Dutch East India Company, but a big takeaway was that Adam Smith hated this theory, and this was probably a good time to shake things up a bit. You see, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, just a few short years before the French Revolution and during the height of the American Revolutionary War. The world had become obsessed with what good government meant. The policies of the past were no longer working in the time of modern industry, and people were out to shake things up. But Adam Smith was not too concerned with what good government meant, but rather what wealth meant. He was effectively arguing that mercantilism, the theory that had dictated the decisions of nations for centuries, was as outdated as a monarchy. Mercantilism was basically the idea that the world was a zero-sum game. If someone was getting richer, it meant someone somewhere else was getting poorer. If a nation increased its wealth, it's because it took that wealth directly or indirectly from another nation. The only thing that was actually seen as industry that produced growth was farming, and that's because it literally produced growth. Like right there, out in the paddocks. All of this was kind of easy to understand, especially in a world that was only just starting to embrace modern manufacturing. In feudal times, the ideologies of mercantilism basically held true. Sure, there were blacksmiths and masons that would build basic tools and construct buildings, but that was extremely basic and lacked much in the way of value adding. Value adding is where you take component parts, say iron ore and coal and the skilled hands of a blacksmith, and turn it into something like a scythe or a sword or a piece of armour. This end product is more valuable than the sum of all of these individual parts, and therefore this whole process was said to have added value. And in economics, this process has a name. It's called production. Now, production was so limited in feudal societies that it didn't really register in the overall wealth of the nation. So again, this theory of mercantilism held true, where a nation was only really as good as the grains it could grow and the gold it could hoard. Adam Smith realised there was more though. The advent of steam power and the popularisation of industrial processes that was taking place during the inception of the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom made a lot of very smart people rethink how they saw wealth. Over the course of a decade of speculation, research and collaboration, Adam Smith and his contemporaries came to the conclusion that manufacturing was kind of the same as farming, in the sense that it grew things of value. In the same way that you contribute seeds, manure, labour and farmland to a crop of wheat, you can throw cotton, labour and a textile mill to grow fabrics. It's just that this process was entirely controlled by man. This was a revolutionary idea, and it basically meant that nations were no longer limited with their lot in life. If they wanted to grow wealthier, they didn't need to invade their neighbours, they could just work on their own industry, improve on technologies and educate their population. This understanding was potentially just as liberating for modernising nations at the time as the steam engines were, and this all also meant that people were incentivised to move from the farms and into the cities. Regular channel viewers would have heard me talk about the factors of production, that is land, labour and capital. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations was the person credited with recognising these factors. Alterations have been made over time to also include entrepreneurship, but what was true back then is just as true today. If you want to produce something, you need these factors of production. Land and labour are easy to understand. You need space to harvest and assemble and store things, and you also need people to toil the fields or hammer on the anvils or write code or whatever. This part of the equation actually wasn't anything new. People had known for generations that the key to a wealthy nation was having lots and lots of land and lots of people to toil on that land. That's why wars were fought over good farmlands, and nobility from across the globe tried to maintain a healthy population of peasants to reap the rewards of these lands. It's unknown if anybody actually wrote this down, but it was kind of something that was so obvious that it wasn't going to make anybody famous for pointing it out. In the same way that I wouldn't become a published academic by suggesting that Game of Thrones Season 8 should not have happened. I mean, it's just so obvious that it doesn't count as cutting-edge research. Adam Smith's contribution, though, was this whole theory of capital, and what he decided capital was. Capital in finance normally just means cash, but capital in economics means basically anything that can contribute value, that isn't land or labour. Cash is capital, sure, but so is a pickaxe or a steam engine, a pair of work boots, or even a patent on some revolutionary social media algorithm. Any material or immaterial thing that assists with the production of goods is said to be capital. And this was a crazy, crazy idea for the time. And what made it even crazier was the way that Adam Smith laid out the logical progression of how people can create value. The Wealth of Nations basically said that there were key steps that a nation would take to grow its wealth. At first, it would be an agrarian nation, pretty much because it's the easiest thing to do. Farming can be as simple as ploughing some dirt and planting some seeds, and of course, this is a massive oversimplification, but basically, if a nation had spare arable land, it just made sense to set up farmland there, because farms literally grow wealth from the dirt and require very, very little capital investment. In this step, nations might also make small-scale efforts to extract precious metals like gold from basic mines as an easy way to supplement the wealth of their farmland. It was theorised by Adam Smith that this was the reason that the Americas had lagged behind European nations in developing modern industry. It's because they didn't really need to. Why on earth would a wealthy American in this time invest money into building a factory when they could instead just go and buy some land, or better yet, just claim some land and turn it into a plantation? The upfront costs are way lower, and if it all goes terribly wrong, well, at least you can still sell the land to someone else. This kind of reasoning was what formed the first step of Smith's progressions of the nation. But then, eventually a nation would hit a problem. Eventually, it would run out of low-hanging fruit of easy arable farmland and have to do something else to continue to grow. Historically, countries answered this problem by invading their neighbours or subjugating some poor colony on the other side of the world, and then using their farmland to continue the accumulation of wealth this way. But ultimately, this was limited, and what was potentially a better idea was to actually use that land you already had more efficiently by developing industry. You see, a factory that produces, let's say textiles, take up much, much less land than a farm, but are able to produce the same amount of profit. But they take much, much more of an investment. So they are not going to be the first choice of a nation to produce until they have absolutely exhausted the wealth they can harvest from their soil. Once a nation does start building these factories though, they will get very, very wealthy, because you can pack a lot more wealth generation into a smaller space. To see this in action, take the economies of China and the United Kingdom during the 1700s. China was a vast, lush and plentiful nation with a large population and extremely arable land. It had absolutely no incentive whatsoever to build factories at this point in time, because it could easily support its population with the farmland that it had available. If someone wanted to get richer, they would just work more farmland. England, on the other hand, was a tiny, desolate rock that had farmland, sure, but it was pretty lackluster in comparison, and almost every square mile of the nation that was usable had been used. So factories were the next logical step on getting wealthier. It's not necessarily that a nation like China wasn't able to embrace this technology, it's more that they had no real incentive to do so. To most people that hear this theory for the first time, it seems pretty silly. In the 21st century, we see nations that transition from agriculture to industry becoming very, very wealthy in a short space of time. So it almost seems like this theory is wrong. But it isn't. Nations and individuals will naturally take the path of least resistance, which means Adam Smith's theory holds true even until this day. Nations start off farming because it is easy. Once they exhaust the potential of that, they move on to industry, and once they have finished with that, they then begin to move on to a service-based economy. This whole path of least resistance thing has also had a lot to do with the other major takeaway from Adam Smith's work. The Wealth of Nations highlighted above all else trade as a key driver that will increase wealth in any market and on any level. Adam Smith used the example of a worker in a pin factory and postulated that if a worker woke up one day and committed his entire working day to producing a pin from scratch, it is extremely unlikely that he would even be able to produce one pin. He would have to dig up the ore and fire the furnace, refine the metal, and then machine it into a pin. And this would take a long, long time. It would also take a lot of expertise. What Adam Smith suggested instead was that one worker specialise in digging up the ore, another specialise in refining it, another specialise in machining it, and then even beyond that, another worker specialise in going out and actually selling these pins. To you and I, this sounds like the most obvious thing ever, but it was a pretty new idea for the ages. On a local level, people tended to be a jack of all trade. Peasants could toil fields, but also build homes and do minor repairs as needed, and the idea that someone would focus their entire work towards one specific task was pretty scary to a lot of people. But it worked. As industrial centres grew, so too did specialised roles. Now with specialised roles came the need to trade. If I worked in a newly created factory as a loom oiler or whatever, well, I can't eat well-oiled looming machines, so I need to make money from my job as a loom oiler and then use that money to buy everything else that I need, as opposed to just doing it all myself. Now because everybody else will be specialised in other roles, they will also need to trade their expertise to facilitate all of their needs in life. And that is okay, because people are becoming so specialised that they will get really, really good at what they are doing, meaning that we will have more stuff overall. The act of trading also has its inherent benefits. You see, people need certain things. You need food and water and shelter and clothing, and if a whole lot of people are getting really good at building homes, let's say, but nobody is making clothes, well, then the supply of clothing will be lower than the demand for clothing, and the price will rise. Savvy and logical participants in the economy will see this and decide that it is a good idea to specialise in making clothes because it is a very profitable industry. And as more people move into that industry and produce more clothes, the price will fall back into line once again. Now the same is true on a larger level, between nations. Smith said that certain nations are inherently better at producing certain goods, and rather than nations trying to make everything themselves, they should instead specialise and trade with each other. This took a little bit longer to catch on though, because well, nations were still obsessed with the zero-sum ideology of mercantilism, where every trade had a winner and a loser, and realistically, it took a while for nations to realise that, hey, actually, trades that are a win-win do exist. This also sounds pretty logical to us today. This whole idea was really highlighted by Adam Smith and was dubbed the guiding hand of the free market. Smith loved this idea so much that he theorised that the best way to improve wealth was just to accommodate this market. Savvy individuals will logically do what is going to be most profitable for them, and the aggregate result of very profitable individuals is a very wealthy nation. To Smith, the role of government was only to make sure that markets were maintained, by jailing scammers and enforcing contracts and making sure people were safe to actually conduct this business, but otherwise they should stay out of it, which again was a very big deal. Feudal monarchies were basically command economies. People got what they were given, and most people lived to produce grains for the state and were housed and protected by their representative lords. Suddenly, everybody having the ability to pick and choose what they wanted was starting to look a lot like some of the political movements at the time. At the same time the American Constitution was being penned, outlining how men had the right to pick and choose their leaders, Adam Smith was outlining how men had the right to pick and choose their own products. Capitalism was democracy with dollars. Popular items got voted for with money, and unpopular products faded into obscurity. So as hard as Smith tried to avoid getting political, he may have helped lay the foundation for the democratic movement that was taking over the modern world at this time. Smith's ideas sound so logical to us today because we live in a wealthy society that was afforded to us by these policies. We don't think twice about using a phone imported from overseas that was made of hundreds of components produced by thousands of people from dozens of countries because we know this is the cheapest and most effective way to produce these kinds of products, thanks to Smith. That was not to say that Smith's ideas were perfect. Oh no. Smith basically invented economics, but he also put a lot of faith in people.
Adam Smith was one of the principals of an astonishing period of human learning called the Scottish Enlightenment during the 18th century. He's the author of two books. In 1759, The Theory of Moral Sentiments was his first book. 1776, the one he's more famous for now, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Those two books together almost single-handedly began the discipline of political economy. Adam Smith called himself a moral philosopher. For him, moral philosophy encompassed all of the investigation that had to do with human behavior. So he's now principally known as the father of economics, and that's because of the book, The Wealth of Nations. If you've heard anything about the wealth of nations, the one phrase you may have heard of is invisible hand. So about halfway through the book, it's 1,000 pages long, chock full of information. About halfway through the book, he uses this phrase, invisible hand, and that phrase is very important because what Smith thought he had discovered was that commercial societies, markets, could enable human beings who are seeking to satisfy their own self-interest to actually benefit other people, even if unintentionally. That's really an amazing insight and one of the key pieces of our understanding today of markets and commercial society. But what might be even more interesting, at least to me, about that Wealth of Nations is at the beginning of it. Remember that the title of the book was An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. So what Smith was interested to know was, why are some places wealthy and other places are not? Well, what Smith didn't say is almost as important as what he did say. It's not because of natural resources. It's not because some races are superior to others. Both of those were explanations that were available and heard at the time. That wasn't it for him. What he thought the key to the difference between wealthy and non-wealthy places was whether they allowed division of labor. Could a person focus on something? Why would that matter? Because if you were allowed to focus on a fairly narrow range of activities, this could unleash your human ingenuity. For Smith, this was really the key to explaining why some places were wealthy and other places were not. It was not those other factors. It was whether the society, whether the community, whether the nation allowed people's individual ingenuity, scope, to investigate, entrepreneurially figure out new ways to do things to satisfy our interests better. Those societies that allowed individuals scope for their ingenuity, they succeeded, they flourished. That was really the key to human prosperity.
So as you can see, a lot of really interesting things out of those video clips. First one, when it comes to Marxism, as you saw, all the different times it's been tried in human history, it has failed. And it's failed except for a very few at the very top. It's failed except for those who are actually running the state. But for the individual person, the promise of Marxism and communism, which is that everybody's going to have a chance, everybody's going to have good working conditions, everyone's going to have a job, everyone's going to have a basic universal income, all the things that sound so good when you think about Marxism and communism, in reality and practice, they don't ever come about. You don't ever see that situation actually be implemented. And those who argue that people haven't actually put Marxism into practice correctly yet, it just hasn't proven out. The people that have tried it have always used it to essentially centralize power into a very small group of people at the top, and centralize power to the detriment of the people. And if you think about on the other side, capitalism and Adam Smith, you think about, you heard in that last little clip about the invisible hand and how important that concept is, that essentially you are doing things for your own individual interest. However, in the capitalist system, where all boats are being lifted, you're helping somebody else on the other side of the world who's producing that product, and you're helping them even if you don't intend to, because of the natural forces that are within the capitalist system, which is essentially wealth grows, productivity grows if you allow the society to have a free market. And so really interesting there to compare these two men with very different backgrounds, born 100 years apart. One, Adam Smith, on the front end of the Industrial Revolution, trying to come up with a way to, how do we raise all boats? How do we increase all economies? How do we allow everyone to flourish? How do we break free from this mindset that it's a zero-sum game and that the pie can grow for everyone? And then 100 years later, on the grievances of the Industrial Revolution in England, you had Marx and Engels coming up with a philosophy of let's provide equity, let's provide guarantee of outcome for everyone, and let's do so by allowing the state to control all economy. And of course, we've seen what that means in practice. Again, it sounds very good, but in practice, it's been actually devastating and really a bad situation for countries that have taken it up. So hopefully you enjoyed learning about Adam Smith, about Karl Marx, about his partner Engels, about the history of capitalism and communism, that you really dive a little bit more into this topic. It's very important. It drives a lot of our politics today. It drives the flourishing of humankind today in all areas of the world, both good and bad. So really interesting topic. As you can see, you could go on forever thinking about all the different angles of both of these theories. So please drop us a comment. Tell us what you think of the program tonight, what you think of Adam Smith versus Karl Marx, of capitalism versus communism. Drop us a comment also about another topic you'd like us to do in a future episode. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time on an episode of Traveling Through History. Hopefully you love history as much as we do. Have a good night.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.